Lecture 4, Egyptian Warfare from the Old to New Kingdom.
Last time we examined military developments among the first cities in Mesopotamia. In this lecture and the next, we turn our attention to the situation in ancient Egypt and focus on the Old to the New Kingdoms, covering the period roughly from about 3100 to 1070 BC. It used to be believed that the Old Kingdom, stretching from about 2700 to 2180 BC, was a largely warless place. The absence of fortifications, overtly military imagery in art and military terminology in texts, suggested to many that the Old Kingdom was a non-military state. Unlike the competitive environment facing the Sumerian city-states, Egypt was a unified polity, focused on its god-king and at peace with itself. Also unlike Sumer, Egypt was geographically isolated, surrounded on three sides by open desert and only accessible overland through the Sinai corridor to the northeast. The Old Kingdom Egyptians, it seemed, were largely left to their own devices by their neighbours and did not face serious external threats. All in all, then, there seemed good reason to suppose that this era of Egyptian history was largely warless. The eminent military historian John Keegan has recently argued an extended version of the warless Egypt model. Keegan points out that Egyptian soldiers down to the New Kingdom era are shown armed only with bow, spear, sword, mace and shield. They have no helmets and no body armour. Soldiers thus equipped will simply not rush into battle to face wounds inflicted by the spear, the sword or the axe. Also, for a period of nearly 1500 years, images of Pharaoh smiting enemies with a mace remained virtually unchanged, from which fact Keegan infers a highly ritualized form of warfare among the ancient Egyptians. As an analogy, he points to the flower wars of the Aztecs. In these strange encounters, Aztec and neighbouring armies would converge on an agreed-upon site, but exchange captives rather than fight a true battle. The armies met, there was much bravado and shouting, and perhaps an individual challenge or two. Then the field between the armies was scattered with red petals to symbolise blood, hence the flowers of the flower wars, and the captives were exchanged to be sacrificed later. Perhaps this is the meaning of the smiting Pharaoh's fixed image. It reflects a ritual of execution following non-lethal battles. And so Keegan concludes, the people of Egypt, over the space of 1400 years, may very well have been spared the reality of war, as other people later experienced it elsewhere altogether. The proposal carries considerable appeal, but it is probably incorrect. With the proper conditioning, warriors will indeed go into shock battles virtually naked. The ancient Gauls, or the Zulus of the 19th and 18th centuries, did so. The latter looked not too different from the models of Egyptian troops in being armed only with hide shields, loincloths and stabbing spears called assegais. Semi-naked Zulu warriors like this fought many pitched battles with their neighbours and later with British colonial forces. Their immense bravery and fearlessness in the face of death and injury are well documented. Indeed, in many warrior cultures, contempt for wounds and death are the marks of a real man, and minimal personal protection readily demonstrates one's courage to peers. Egyptian soldiers could surely have been similarly conditioned, especially if seeking to impress their god-king or his battlefield commanders. Secondly, one cannot read too much historical significance into the continuity of Egyptian artistic representations of Pharaoh. The artistic vocabulary developed in the Old Kingdom was retained for centuries, or if it fell out of fashion from time to time, fads for archaism would revive it. So identical or similar looking scenes of Pharaoh smiting enemies occurring centuries apart need say little or nothing about actual military practice. The same caution, by the way, applies to the depictions of common soldiers. Even if they are shown minimally protected, they might not have looked like this in real life. Middle Kingdom weapons found in archaeological contexts, for instance, do not show up in the iconography, which retains this traditional look of the Old Kingdom depictions. So perhaps the very notion of the nearly naked Egyptian warrior is itself the result of an overly naive reading of the iconography. None of this is to say that Egyptian battles lacked a ritualized element. All battle, as we've seen since the first lecture, is a cultural process marked by ritual. The issue rather is whether Egyptian warfare was as non-lethal as Keegan imagines, and on this point there is good reason to think not. Indications of Egyptian militarism are to be found even in the pre-dynastic period before the Old Kingdom arose. An artifact called the Fortress or Cities Palette, dating to perhaps 3100 BC, appears to show fortified towns. Depicted from a bird's eye perspective, the towns have circuit walls with projecting towers, which are clearly defensive features since they allow fire to go down the side of the walls. Further, these towns appear to be under attack by animals bearing what look like compasses. Now, based on later Egyptian artistic practice, the animals may symbolize army units and the compasses, so-called battering rams of some sort. Another pre-dynastic object, the battlefield palette, shows animals representing leaders attacking people, vultures pecking at corpses, and bound prisoners of war being marched off. The famous palette of about 3000 BC that honors Narmer, who unified Egypt and founded the first dynasty, shows, on one side, Narmer smashing kneeling enemies on the head with a mace in the pose that inspired Keegan's musings about ritualized non-lethal warfare. On the other, 4 men bearing animal standards march before Narmer toward a line of headless corpses neatly stacked or laid out in a row. The standards can be reasonably taken to represent army units, the headless corpses the consequences of battle, and the mace-wielding Narmer the commander-in-chief. All of this suggests a warlike Egypt in the Old Kingdom. Other considerations point in the same direction. In the first place, state ideology was highly ethnocentric. Egypt and the pharaoh represented order and decency, foreigners, chaos and vileness. Egypt's foreign enemies in all eras are referred to as wretched or vile. Geographic isolation cuts both ways. It may help insulate a country from outside interference, but it may also lead to the sort of extreme ethnocentric outlook that fuels vicious wars. The latter appears to have been the case in ancient Egypt. We have positive evidence for all this in the Old Kingdom tomb of Weni, or sometimes Uni, dated to about 2350 BC. Here, autobiographical inscriptions record 5 campaigns against Asiatics who were upon the sands, as the text has it. Weni commanded an army of locally levied units, raised in regional administrative boroughs called nomes, and commanded by the local big men called nomarchs. Such a method of muster mirrors how corvée labour gangs were raised to work on major royal projects like the pyramids. In fact, for many Egyptian levies, warfare was probably just another form of service demanded by the king. If so, this was no professional standing army, though palace guards may have provided a core of semi-professional troops. Weni also mentions Nubians and Libyans in the pharaoh's ranks. Whether these were captives forced into service or soldiers of fortune out for hire is impossible to say. Weni numbers his army vaguely as many 10,000s. More significant is Weni's title. He is Chief Domain Supervisor of the Palace. Sub-commanders are identified as civic bureaucrats who carry similar titles. Seal-bearers of the king, or nomarchs and mayors of Upper and Lower Egypt, or the Chief Prophet of Upper Egypt. It seems that such people fulfilled both civilian and military functions, which explains the absence of clear military titles in most Old Kingdom texts. Military command was only one part of an official's duties, and so lies concealed behind innocuous-sounding civilian designations. If so, then army service may have been seen as somehow lacking in social prestige. So in their tombs, officials stressed their civilian titles and duties over their military service, Weni being the whistleblowing exception. Therefore, the absence of a military vocabulary cannot be read, as it often has, as evidence for the absence of warfare in Old Kingdom Egypt. When Weni describes his campaigns against the Asiatics, there is nothing ritualistic and non-lethal about them. On the contrary, they are presented, even celebrated, as practically genocidal, and I quote, "The army returned in safety after it had hacked up the land of the sand dwellers. The army returned in safety after it had crushed the land of the sand dwellers. The army returned in safety after it had thrown down its enclosures. The army returned in safety after it had cut down its fig trees and its vines. The army returned in safety after it had cast fire into all its dwellings. The army returned in safety after it had killed troops in it by the 10,000s. The army returned in safety after it had taken troops in it, a great multitude, as living captives." The form of this, by the way, suggests it may have been a prayer, a litany of some sort, recited upon the return of the army from its campaign. Now, it's immediately evident that the so-called sand dwellers are not nomads, but settled agriculturists. They have enclosures, dwellings, vines, and figs. The very term sand dwellers, then, is itself an example of the ethnocentric worldview of the Old Kingdom, and a warning that labels and titles in these texts ought not to be read at face value. These are propagandistic documents and not objective wartime reports. This doesn't mean that they are outright false, only that caution is needed in interpreting their content, particularly when that content has an overtly political purpose, here to glorify the pharaoh. A good example of what I mean is Winnie's comment that he had to go back 5 times to put down rebellions among these sand dwellers. Now, is this language literal? Had pacts been made and then broken? Or is it ideological? Are the Egyptians claiming suzerainty over unconquered territory in the way the Spanish were to do in the New World? For Winnie's part, his motives are presented as wholly personal, and he says, "I acted with regard to that for which His Majesty would show me favour." No doubt, Pharaoh's favour was made manifest in innumerable material ways. So a key message buried in the text, and one repeated throughout the ancient Mediterranean basin, is war pays. Aside from Winnie's inscription, 4 Old Kingdom tombs are decorated with siege scenes, the technical details of which we will survey in Lecture 8. We merely note here that such stylized images are hard to read straightforwardly. Were sieges the prime mode of Old Kingdom warfare, as some scholars have concluded? Or did sieges mark the climax of a campaign and thus come to dominate the Old Kingdom representations of war? Indeed, do these scenes accurately depict specific encounters at all? None of this is evident from the images alone. And finally, we have finds of actual weapons. Maces and clubs were popular in Old Kingdom Egypt, even though a mace is effectively countered with a helmet. Whereas the Mesopotamians developed helmets early on, and also socket axes to penetrate them, the Egyptians did not clearly adopt helmets until the New Kingdom. So maces retained their usefulness in Egypt long after they had been relegated to status symbols elsewhere. Instead of penetrating narrow-bladed socket axes, the Egyptians preferred a wider-bladed slashing weapon called the epsilon axe, so named for its similarity to the Greek letter epsilon. Daggers, spears, and bows have also been found, or are depicted in the siege scenes. All in all, then, the evidence suggests that Old Kingdom Egypt was not as warless as was once thought, or as Keegan's more recent model suggests. Frequency is impossible to quantify, but if Winnie's inscription is anything to go by, Pharaoh had regular and ruthless dealings with the despised Asiatics to the north. Despite the propagandistic purposes of Winnie's inscription, this detail smacks of the truth. In general, wars between ethnically distinct groups are more vicious and brutal than wars fought among people who feel some affinity for each other. Studies of soldiers' outlooks in World War II suggest that American troops in Europe felt some sympathy for German captives who were white Europeans like themselves, while those in the Pacific theatre tended to harbour less forgiving attitudes towards their Japanese opponents, and vice versa, of course. So might it have been in Old Kingdom Egypt, where Asiatics were a target of outright contempt, as well as repeated expeditions that dealt out death and destruction in spades. The collapse of central authority at the end of the Old Kingdom initiated a poorly documented period of disunity called the First Intermediate Period that stretched more or less from 2180 to 2040 BC. This era saw Egypt regionalized as local nomarchs rose to prominence and ruled over their nomes. Internal fighting made war respectable to talk about, so warfare appears in the records of the subsequent Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 to 1650 BC, more obtrusively than it did in the Old Kingdom. Depictions of warfare in tombs of the Middle Kingdom era are more numerous than they are for the Old Kingdom. There are 10 for the Middle Kingdom, as opposed to only 4 for the Old. These depictions are, again, overwhelmingly of sieges. Weapons improve in quality. The composite bow was introduced from Asia, but it was not widely used. Instead, a type called the double convex bow predominated, with an effective range of about 150 yards or so. Improvements were made to the epsilon axe head to give it greater penetrating power. Slings, spears, and javelins were also attested. Swords first appear in this period, but only come into widespread use in the subsequent New Kingdom. But it seems from all this that the armory of the Middle Kingdom Egyptians had been enlarged and diversified by the internal conflicts that marked the First Intermediate Period. The Middle Kingdom also preserves model units of Egyptian soldiery. The troops are depicted in organized ranks, trained and disciplined. They are clearly of different racial stocks, with care taken to distinguish the darker-skinned Nubians from the lighter brown Egyptians. The Egyptian army, therefore, appears to have been a multi-ethnic force, very much like Wayne's army of the preceding Old Kingdom, with its local Egyptian levies, Libyans and Nubians, if we remember. More striking still is the evidence from fortifications. At Buhen in southern, or Upper Egypt, as it's sometimes called, a fort of the 20th and 19th centuries BC was built as a bastion against the Nubians, and it has been discovered and excavated. It shows a surprisingly high degree of sophistication. The fort, home to a garrison of a few hundred men, had mud brick walls almost 30 feet high, with narrow piers every few feet to allow a wooden overhang to be stretched between them. From this overhang, rocks could be dropped down on those attacking the wall below. The walls were built with reed mats between the brick courses for extra stability and strength, and they had a glacis, that is, a sloping, thickened lower section to deter sapping and battering. That is to say, attempts to bore through the wall, either with machines or with poles. The gatehouse had massive towers that projected both internally and externally to create a 70-foot-long corridor down which would-be attackers would have to fight to gain entry. More remarkably, the whole fort was surrounded by an outer rampart with projecting semicircular bastions equipped with downward-facing firing slots, and beyond this outer wall was a ditch 24 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Now, the complexities of the Buhen fortress reveal not only the advanced engineering capabilities of the Middle Kingdom military architects, but also the sophistication they expected from the would-be attackers. Buhen was designed and built not to deter unruly barbarian mobs, but to repel well-orchestrated assaults. What is preserved at Buhen therefore infers much about what is not. There are other Middle Kingdom fortifications of note, such as the so-called Wall of the Ruler, that protected the northern approaches to Egypt from across the Sinai. Now, little has been found of this entrenchment, leading many to suppose that it was a chain of forts, rather like the ones to the south, rather than a contiguous curtain on the model of the Great Wall of China or Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Written evidence lends support to this conclusion. We find reflected in Middle Kingdom texts a complex world of war, commerce, diplomacy, and mercenary engagements between Egypt and Syria-Palestine. The story of Sinuhe, set in the mid-20th century BC, stands out. Now, this may be a genuine autobiography or a work of fiction. Either way, it tells us much about military matters in the Middle Kingdom era. Sinuhe is a senior officer in the service of the Dauphin Senusert. When the prince succeeds to the throne as Senusert I, who ruled from 1971 to 1928 BC, Sinuhe overhears a conversation that frightens him. Now, we're never actually told what he heard, but it causes him to flee Egypt altogether. So he slips past the forts of the Wall of the Ruler, made to oppose the Asiatics and crush the sand dwellers, as the text has it, and goes to live in a place called Retinue, which was in Canaan. Here he makes a living as a mercenary commander, training the native troops and earning the respect and loyalty of an Asiatic prince. He is granted honor, status, and wealth. He marries, has a family, and raises them to adulthood. One day, Sinuhe is challenged to a duel by the best warrior in a rival Asiatic army. A David and Goliath-like single combat follows. The two men advance on each other. Sinuhe dodges the champion's arrows, then hits him in the neck with an arrow of his own before finishing him off with a battle axe. He gloats over his fallen foe and strips his armor. Later, an Egyptian emissary arrives and summons Sinuhe home, where he is reconciled with Pharaoh and dies an honored man in his homeland. The story shows that relations between Egypt and the Asiatics were far more complex than the official propaganda might suggest. Further, there appears to be a market for mercenaries, and warfare is seen to offer a ready path to riches, respect, status, even for outcasts like Sinuhe. War pays. The duel scene contains useful details of how different weapons were used. Sinue is equally adept with missile and shock weapons, though we cannot be absolutely sure that all Egyptian soldiers were similarly well trained. Sinue may be an exception. He's a commander, a man of special talents, at least so he says himself. Another informative text is the Stela of Khusebek from Abydos, which dates to about 1880 BC. The Stela records the career of a fighter and commander of what appears to be an elite corps of troops around the pharaoh who fight in squadrons of 7 or 8 men. Khusebek goes and campaigns against the Asiatics to the north and against the Nubians to the south. He is advanced and enriched by displaying his valor in battle under the very gaze of Pharaoh. He receives rewards of gold and promotion for his deeds. Need I say it? War pays. The Stela contains an interesting detail. In one Asiatic campaign, Khusebek proudly proclaims that he fought with the rearguard, and I quote, "without deviating from the fight, for my face was forward, and I did not turn my back on the Asiatic," unquote. If a fighting retreat was required, it would appear that this expedition was not entirely successful. If this inference is correct, here is a good example of how these inscriptions twist the truth without betraying it entirely. We cannot expect them to state openly that Pharaoh's campaign against the Asiatics failed. Rather, a negative, the retreat, is presented as a positive, Khusebek's bravery, but without an outright lie claiming a success that wasn't there. It is left to the reader to infer what happened from the slanted language. The Middle Kingdom came to an end in the early to mid-17th century BC, ushering in the so-called Second Intermediate Period, also known as the Hyksos invasion, which ran more or less from 1660 to 1570 BC. The Hyksos were foreigners of uncertain origin who ruled Lower Egypt from their capital at Avaris in the Nile Delta. I should explain here that Lower Egypt means the northern part of Egypt, and Upper Egypt means the southern part of Egypt, because the Nile flows from south to north. So when you go upriver, you are going south. Hyksos only controlled the lower part of Egypt, or the Nile Delta in the north. It used to be believed that the Hyksos introduced the chariot to the Egyptians, but this view does not have archaeological support. No definite finds of Hyksos chariots have turned up in decades of excavation in Egypt. As a result, most scholars now think that chariotry, in the sense of organized chariot units deployed en masse on the battlefield, only came to Egypt in the New Kingdom, not with the Hyksos. Individual chariots might well have appeared earlier, but they were not used in the tactical sense just outlined. The New Kingdom, which stretched from about 1570 to 1070 BC, was formed after several generations of warfare against the Hyksos in the 17th and 16th centuries BC. Equipped with an ideology of liberation from foreign domination, the New Kingdom was an aggressive military state that expanded its borders north into Syria, Palestine, and south into Nubia. Accounts of the early campaigns against the Hyksos are scant. One of the fullest is a schoolboy tablet from Thebes, the so-called Carnahan Tablet number 1, the text of which seems to be based on contemporary historical inscriptions. Tomb inscriptions help fill out the picture to some degree. These texts contain interesting information about early New Kingdom warfare. We read that Pharaoh had a council of noble advisors whom he consulted about strategy. The advisors act as foils to Pharaoh's wisdom. Their plan is presented and then rejected by the king. Plunder and booty play a major role in the commemoration of warfare. "My soldiers were as lions are," goes the text, "with their spoil having serfs, cattle, milk, fat, and honey, dividing up their property, their hearts gay." The property, of course, being the enemy's property. Another text details how hands were cut off enemy corpses as proof of kills, and rewards granted in the form of gold from the pharaoh. There was even a specific military award called the Gold of Valor. People were part of the spoils, enslaved and granted to their captors by the king. In these texts, chariots appear on the Egyptian side, but they are reserved for the king and the nobles. The rest fight on foot. So the chariot in the early New Kingdom was not yet the important armament it was to be a century later. These texts also mention long sieges, one lasting 3 years. As to New Kingdom weaponry, the old toolbox remained in use with two major innovations: the composite bow and the sword. The composite bow, as reviewed in the previous lecture, was particularly well suited to chariot warfare, which came to dominate the New Kingdom's military practice. Its small size but great range and penetrating power made it ideal for use in the confined space of a chariot carriage. Swords, known since the Middle Kingdom, now became more common, particularly the sickle sword. Helmets were finally introduced to Egypt during the New Kingdom period, though they make only rare appearances in the iconography. Evidence for New Kingdom military operations is extensive. Texts record a complex military organization with a substantial officer corps. The army is divided into chariotry and infantry, and vaguely designated as hosts. The infantry was organized into contingents of 50. These were grouped into companies of 250, and the companies grouped into 4 divisions of 5,000, each named after a god: Amun, Re, Ptah, and Seth. Each of the 20 companies that made up a division had a commander and a scribe, and a variety of officers were ranged below these. A full Egyptian mobilization could therefore field 20,000 infantry alone. Infantry, so far as we can tell, were conscripted locally and housed, fed, and equipped and trained by the state. By around 1500 BC, chariotry is found as a separate division of the Egyptian army, with its own officer corps and titulature. The chariots were organized into units of 10 up to a maximum of 50 and attached to the infantry divisions. A massive logistical effort was needed to maintain this wing of the army, since each chariot was drawn by 2 horses that needed to be housed, fed, trained, and maintained by specialist staff. Administrative records reveal that a typical chariot was equipped with 1 or 2 composite bows, 2 or 4 quivers that held up to 80 arrows, a spear and/or a javelin, and a shield and an axe. All of this materiel, as well as the carriage itself, required artisans to build and repair and crews to maintain. As we shall see in the next lecture, the battles of Megiddo and Kadesh suggest that the number of chariots in the New Kingdom's arsenal stretched into the thousands, although we may expect some exaggeration on this point. But nevertheless, the administrative effort needed to maintain several thousand horses and perhaps 1,000 or so chariots was truly gargantuan and stands as a testament to the impressive organizational abilities of the ancient Egyptians. There are 2 main camps of opinion on how the Egyptian chariot was used in battle. One was it charged into enemy units as a shock weapon. The other was that it acted as a fire platform and screened infantry as it formed up. Chariots and their armaments surely provide the best clues as to their use. Egyptian chariots were light, 2-horsed vehicles and carried a crew of 2, a driver and a warrior armed with a composite bow or a javelin. The light nature of the vehicle strongly suggests that it was a fire platform, not a shock weapon. Charging into disciplined infantry is something horses in any age will usually refuse to do. In any case, the shock of such an impact was just as likely to prove fatal to the charioteers as to their targets. The horses would be disabled, the vehicle rendered immobile, and the crew would be sitting ducks. In the main then, Egyptian chariots were probably used to lay down a screen of fire as infantry units formed up behind, and also to harass the enemy as they approached. They may have also been used to chase down broken enemy troops. This indeed was one of the chief functions of cavalry in later eras. I would also suggest that a charge of massed chariots, even if aborted before the actual shock, would have been a hugely intimidating psychological experience for enemy infantrymen, all the more so if they were untrained conscripts. Such a charge could have been especially effective either at the opening of an engagement to get the enemy to flee without a fight, or as a mental hammer blow against infantry on the verge of breaking. Finally, the shock weapons in the chariot need to be accounted for. They were either there as weapons of last resort, or they were employed to cut down fleeing enemies, or the warrior crew member could dismount and fight with them, the axe and so on foot. Pharaoh was depicted as doing just that in some New Kingdom reliefs. But the shock weapons were secondary elements in the chariot's armory. Its main function was that of a mobile firing platform. It would take considerable training to fire a bow from a moving chariot, and this is likely part of the reason that the chariot remained the prestige weapon of the Egyptian army in the New Kingdom, crewed by princes, noblemen, and other people of superior socio-economic status. This again is paralleled in the cavalry forces of later eras. The chariot was not the tank of the late Bronze Age battlefield, it was the Lamborghini. The prestige value of the chariot also explains why in surviving Egyptian battle accounts, that vehicle dominates the narrative. This was the weapon on the field, owned and operated by the important people, including Pharaoh himself. We should not therefore conclude from the textual focus on the chariot, as some have done, that infantry was either tactically irrelevant or even non-existent on the Egyptian battlefield. That would be too hasty a judgment to make on the basis of slanted evidence. So in the next lecture, we will turn our attention to 2 Egyptian battle narratives and see what they can tell us about the specifics of how the New Kingdom army functioned on the field.